Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so Marvel 2099 is back, and one part of me is very excited about this, right? Like one part of me is just like, yes, 2099, I love this future, you know, these future stories and so on. Another part of me is like, 1997, is that you? In the sense that I'm kind of worried that like, it's gonna turn into Marvel 2099 in 1997. There's a part of me that's kind of worried about that, but the cool thing is we're gonna go with this and we're gonna see what happens. Now, here is one of the interesting things about this, right? This is an alpha shot, right? This is an alpha comic. Those of you guys who were new to this, they don't really do this too much anymore. They used to do it all the time. Really, Marvel used to do it like all the time back in the 1990s. You would have like some great big huge story that was going to take place. So it would be like this one shot, which would be the alpha story, like Age of Apocalypse, for example. You have Age of Apocalypse Alpha and then Age of Apocalypse Omega. So you have the alpha comic, which basically intros everything. Then you have the Omega comic, which ends everything. And it just kind of wraps the whole story up. Everything kind of takes place in between. This is an alpha comic insofar as what this is designed to do is to essentially preview everything that's to come, right? To kind of give us a general idea of the landscape, but only insofar as it gives us things to kind of look at, right? So like if you guys remember All New, All Different Marvel .1 or .0, whatever it was, that one shot that was like, here's how everything's gonna go. That's basically what it is. And so what this does here is this picks up in a place called the Ravage. Now, I don't remember a location called the Ravage from Marvel 2099 back in the 90s. I remember a character named Ravage who was created by Stan Lee and Paul Ryan. He was okay. I mean, he was an alright character. Like, I wasn't really interested in him too much, but he was one of the first to be introduced in 1992, right? And so anyway, regardless, like you basically have this girl who's kind of stumbling around, and this girl discovers a hammer of Thor. Now, the reason why I say a hammer of Thor is that what you have are basically these various individuals who are wielding Thor hammers. And the reason why is because what you had in Marvel 2099 is you had what was called the Church of Thor. And the Church of Thor were like these religious zealots, basically, who believed that Thor would return one day. And so they kind of followed these ideologies that like he would smite the world of like corporations and so on and so forth. Because in Marvel 2099, that was a landscape whereby corporate America basically conquered everything, right? So everything was divvied up and controlled by corporations. It was a pretty bleak and crappy environment, but the Thorites always came into conflict with the cops. Now, so it was kind of a cool thing because then what you also have is you have basically the Punisher from 2099 who started out as a cop, right? Who started out as like one of these cops. And so the indication here kind of seems to be that like at some point, one of these guys is going to end up facing off against each other. But regardless of the circumstance, somebody has seemingly been strung up, you know, with regards, or I guess with their Thor hammer. And that's really kind of it, right? But what this is designed to do, this little opening segment here, what it's designed to do is kind of show madness in the streets, right? It's designed to show that like this environment that we're living in, this future is bleak and dark and very twisted and very screwed up. But that's the other thing to understand here is for Marvel 2099, this is, I wouldn't really say a hard reboot so much as like a reworking or a reintroduction of it, like a reworking and reintroduction. So there could be things here that change, right? Like this one particular guy who was wielding the hammer Mjolnir looked like Thor, right? So we may actually get the return of Odin's son. That may not really just be confined to the Church of Thor in the early days, right? It may just be like, instead of having to wait for Thor 2099, we just get him right off the bat and it's just a whole new person, you know, who's wielding the hammer of Thor, but who's also a dick. You know, we don't really know. Like it's one of the cool things about this, which is why I really enjoy it, because it's as much familiar as it is potentially different, right? So that's what makes it kind of cool. But then you switch over to Miguel O'Hara. Right now, for the most part, Spider-Man 2099 doesn't really need a kind of introduction. I mean, you sort of get it insofar as, hey, like you've got Tyler Stone and you've got Miguel O'Hara, and you have him basically working with Alchemax, and then Alchemax kind of doing their thing, and there was an attempt to recreate Spider-Man with a guy named Mr. Sims that ended up turning out to be like this just giant grotesque spider that just sort of, you know, became all awry and screwed up and then ultimately died. I mean, there's these little things in terms of the story of Miguel O'Hara, but the reality of this is Spider-Man 2099 has been around for so long that really his story is pretty much known, right? So they're kind of retreading water here. Honestly, the reason why they probably threw it in here was just for the sake of simplicity, just for the sake of saying, hey, look, if we're going to show Marvel 2099, we might as well show all the major players, right? And Spider-Man Miguel O'Hara is the biggest player from the 2099 universe insofar as reader popularity, right? So that part's pretty straightforward. But the really cool thing that comes from this is you end up transitioning out to what looks like the moon, and you basically have an individual. You have like these two voices kind of going back and forth. It's almost reminiscent of the Earth X storyline. and one of them is saying like, what am I seeing? You know, asking the question, what am I seeing? And the other one is saying, you're seeing a world that's basically lost, where the superheroes have lost their way, humanity's lost its way, things are kind of going awry, different scenarios like that, so on and so forth. It brings the idea of like a Conan 2099, so we're kind of introduced to a little bit of a teaser for his character, but then you end up learning the two voices that are talking here are Dr. Doom and Uatu the Watcher. Now, here's the important thing to understand here, and here's where my questions begin to come into play. If you guys remember the events of Original Sin, Uatu the Watcher was killed by Nick Fury, and the result was that as punishment for killing one of the Watchers, the rest of the Watchers confined Nick Fury to the moon, and he was going to be the unseen, the guy who was going to watch everything and basically not be seen, right? Nobody was going to really know he was there, with the exception of one or two people. Nobody was going to talk to him. It was a way for Marvel to just kind of remove him from the landscape, right? But to put him on the back burner and say, we can bring him back somewhere along the line. The idea here is that Uatu the Watcher has basically returned. Now, this is when things get kind of murky, is because you could look at Marvel 2099 and say, okay, but this is an alternate reality future, one of many futures that exist in Marvel Comics, and the result is that the Watcher could be back there. And that would be true had Marvel not done the Goblin Nation storyline from Dan Slott. A lot of people are saying that the more recent Amazing Spider-Man story is the one that makes Marvel 2099 the absolute future. That was done long before that, right? They're probably just not aware, or they forgot during Goblin Nation. But Goblin Nation, which was a story involving Norman Osborn as a Goblin King under Dan Slott's run on Spider-Man, basically had Miguel O'Hara and Peter Parker team up. And then it was like, Marvel 2099 is the guaranteed future, right? That is going to come and pass, right? And everything that takes place in this Marvel 2099 universe is going to happen, right? So it's the guaranteed future. What it means is that if this is the guaranteed future of Marvel, whether you choose to follow the Goblin Nation storyline or you choose to go with what happened in Amazing Spider-Man number 34, I think it was, regardless of the circumstance, if you look at this and you say, okay, this is the guaranteed future, then where did Uatu the Watcher come from? How did he come back? And that may be a question they do or do not answer. I mean, obviously what you have here is you basically have him like hooked up to a chair and you've got something in place of his eyes, right? So it may be, I mean, with his eyes having been removed by Nick Fury, it could be that like he was resurrected, or maybe he's hooked up to machines and is just kind of functioning in some base level state. But being able to have like cohesive conversations indicates it is full on Uatu the Watcher in the form that we remember somehow having returned, which begs the question, how do we get to this point? And so that's when you start to sort of talk about what's going on with Dr. Doom in 2099. And what you end up getting is this really cool circumstance. And this is where Marvel's changing things from the way it originally was in the 2099 universe. In the 2099 universe back in the 1990s, what you had was this massive war that broke out between mutants and humans, right? It was the mutant-human war, which had been teased for decades, right? I mean, it had been teased for eons since Chris Claremont took over, started with Project Wide Awake, and then went into the Mutant Registration Act and all that kind of stuff. And it was like, at some point, a war is going to break out between humans and mutants. And it did, right? And the result was that you kind of led to this sort of almost complete and total collapsing of society. In this one, what you end up getting here is this massive civil war between the superheroes that basically leads to this future. And this is why things get kind of crazy, right? Because as cool as this is, this future really kind of seems to stem out of a lot of what ifs, right? Like, what if the Civil War never ended? Like, I mean, Civil War ended and all the superheroes are friends, which means that maybe somewhere along the line, another Civil War breaks out. Hopefully not Civil War 2, that story sucked, but hopefully something like Civil War 3, that basically breaks out. And then like we end up having the Marvel 2099 universe. Honestly, what I'm really kind of hoping they do here, because this isn't really enough for us to explicitly know what's going on, what I'm really hoping we get is some kind of like a one-shot or an expose or something like that basically says like, here's the chronological history as it exists now with Marvel 2099. Either we're keeping all the original stuff, or we're changing it, we're bringing in new stuff, or whatever the case happens to be, but to give us an updated kind of origin on how this universe came into existence, or at least what led to this particular timeline in terms of things that took place in the past. But following this, what you end up having is a guy who is basically escaping these various police forces in one of the towns and ends up in Transverse City. Now, Transverse City was one of the original introductions in Marvel 2099, and this is basically a lawless town, but it's lawless only so long as you keep moving, right? So you could do anything you want to, so long as you're always on the move, so long as you're traveling somewhere. Now you can come and go, right? And Transverse City kind of occupied the space between Detroit and Chicago, or at least, what was Detroit and is Chicago. It's just this giant, mega city, more or less. And so basically you could do whatever you want here, as long as you're constantly driving when you do. Like, you could stop for a split second, but if you stop too long, the cops will catch you and they'll arrest you and take you away. And so it's kind of a crazy thing, because this guy ends up sort of just running, or at least as he's trying to make this escape, he's caught up by one guy with of course, longer hair. And this person's like, hey, look, I can help you out. I mean, your car's pretty damaged, so on and so forth. We could take care of it for you. And when they get him to a mechanic, of course, they end up basically saying, we're going to charge you like $300, right? Like, we're going to rip you off. Pretty bad, just to fix this one little thing. Not only that, like, once it happens, they basically just start like piecemealing his car, right? They just kind of start screwing him over. And then the guy on the motorcycle basically takes off. It's like, thanks a lot, man. And then basically bails. And that's kind of the crazy thing here, because who this guy is, we'll find out here in in a second. But at that point, that's when you jump over to the character of Herbie. This is why I say it's the nature of these kind of alpha comics. You jump really fast from one thing to the next to kind of give us a preview of everything that's going on. And you basically have a couple of guys who are sitting in a bar who are starting to problem, or really just kind of talking about their stories and, you know, probably embellishing, so on and so forth. And you have little Herbie. Now, Herbie was a part of the Fantastic Four back in the day. He was kind of created as part of the Fantastic Four team. And ultimately, when he shows up here, it's saying things like, you know, can you help me find my mother's friends? You know, my mom sent me out here, said find her friends, and I'm trying to find them and so on, but I'm not having any luck. And, you know, can you help me out? Not really knowing what Herbie's stumbling into. Now, of course, Herbie was going to be dismantled and taken apart. You know, Herbie was going to be eliminated, but then Herbie is ultimately saved by Venture. Now, again, this is where things get kind of interesting, because originally Venture was a bounty hunter that was tasked with basically tracking down Miguel O'Hara. And so he originally appeared in Spider-Man 2099 issue number 2, and only showed up for about 8 issues, right? He wasn't a very long, or at least the guy version of him back in the day wasn't a very long-standing character. Instead, like, he was just kind of a character that was there. Now, of course, it's a chick in this one. The idea is that they seem like they're going to have a bigger part. Like, she's going to have a much bigger part than in previous years, which is actually going to be kind of cool. I'm curious to see what that role is going to be. I mean, pairing her up with Herbie and then having her go through and help Herbie, I'm curious if it's really going to be more of an adventure following her or whatever the case is. But I have a very hard time believing she's going to be confined to like 8 appearances, you know, in the 29 stories, and that's going to be it. So this is why I say this is as much a reshuffling and a changing up as anything else, right? Things are just kind of moving away and sort of shifting around and so on and so forth. So it's as much introduction of new stuff as it is old stuff. But it's one of the funny things, because you kind of begin to sort of wrap this up when you end up getting with Dr. Doom and the Watcher, who are sort of watching these things go down. And when you have the Watcher and Dr. Doom conversing with each other, it's basically like there's other people who are trying to impersonate Dr. Doom, seemingly trying to take on his armor or whatever the case is. But it's one of these things where like Dr. Doom is kind of like this world that he perceives is not a terrible place, right? It's a great place to be in. It's a world where people are basically free of their most base ambitions or desires. They can kind of be themselves, whatever the case is. But it's a pretty screwed up scenario. What this does is it basically says all these things that we've seen so far over the course of this comic, we're going to see continued in Conan, in Ghost Rider, Punisher, Fantastic Four, and Spider-Man, of course, all these being 2099 titles. And as far as I'm aware, I think these are going to be one-shots, but they may be ongoing series. I want to say I read somewhere at one point that they were all going to be one-shots. I should probably follow up on that so I know what kind of stories I'm going to be covering. But it is cool, right? I mean, it's a good little preview issue. That's really what this is, right? That's really all of these things were just preview issues, right? So this will basically let us kind of go through and see all these different things, you know, to watch for like the major 2099 event, which is probably going to spin out into a whole series of 2099 stories. And yeah, so with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become a member of the Rob Corps. There we go. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.